Hi everyone, today we're going to discuss the 2017 Urquhart and Brusso case study, which examines filled pauses as a site of contact-induced change in Boston Spanish. First of all, let's start with a bit of background. Let's look at the history of linguistic contact between Spanish and English. Historically, in the United States, language contact was largely due to conquests, slavery, and immigration. Spanish and English, along with other languages, have formed today's linguistic variation in the United States. Today, there are many Hispanic and bilingual groups throughout the United States, and this linguistic diversity creates variety and change. Boston has seen a dramatic increase in its Hispanic population since 2000, over 25% according to data records. When looking at this study, one thing to note was, what is language contact? As Thomason states, it is the use of more than one language in the same place at the same time. Sankoff says that language contact is part of the social fabric of everyday life for hundreds of millions of people over the world. Wimford also acknowledges that most, if not all, languages have been influenced at one time or another by contact with others. Bilingualism and language contact has been common throughout much of human history, and today many people in the world are bilingual. Spanish and English are spoken alongside each other on a massive scale. When speakers of different languages interact closely, it is typical for their languages to influence each other. In an ever more connected world, more speakers of different languages are in contact and have access to global culture, which is currently dominated by English. As a result, across the world, many languages show traces of borrowing from English. Language contact situations affect the linguistic system, the relationship between the speakers, and the linguistic outcome. The linguistic system is often influenced by borrowing. Hoffer defines borrowings as the process of importing linguistic items from one linguistic system into another. A process occurs any time two cultures are in contact over a period of time. We normally distinguish between lexical borrowing, grammatical borrowing, and phonological borrowing. Over the course of history, evidence has shown the linguistic effects of languages in contact and how these shape language change. Language not only borrows words from one another, but also grammatical features and structures, although less frequently. In the study we're going to discuss, it focuses on grammatical borrowing. To be more specific, the borrowing of discourse markers, or otherwise known as filled pauses. So more importantly, what is a filled pause? The sound produced during spontaneous speech that represents a pause filled by vocalization. A filled pause occurs most often when a speaker is thinking. It is a filled pause in that the speaker actually breaks our speech while continuing to articulate. Filled pauses have many realizations, including lexicalized and non-lexicalized forms, the former consisting of regular words and the latter being the non-lexical element. And well are common filled pauses among English speakers. Filled pauses can occur anywhere in the stream of speech and are hesitation sounds that speakers employ to indicate uncertainty and to maintain control of a conversation while thinking of what to say next. Filled pauses do not add any new information to the conversation, and they do not alter the meaning of what is uttered. They are language specific and constitute sites for cross-linguistic comparison and contrast. University of Pennsylvania linguist Mark Lieberman says filled pauses can be used to hold a place in conversation, to interrupt, to introduce a thought, or even to communicate something about what's being introduced.
In terms of the study itself, the central research question posed by Urquhart and Brusso was, is contact with English promoting linguistic convergence in the filled pause behaviour of Spanish speakers? The aim of Urquhart and Brusso's study was to see how these processes were affecting lexical and phonological filled pauses respectively. The dependent variable here is the type of filled pause used, and of course the way it's used. In terms of the variables and variants at play, we can see 9 overall. 6 lexical filled pauses: bueno, como, este, o sea, so, as in the English word so, and y. And then we have 3 phonological filled pauses: e or em, a or am, and or While of course these aren't phonetic variants of the same thing, they can be considered variable ways of saying the same thing. That is, please wait, I'm thinking. As for linguistic factors, the investigators identify 4 main ones, some with subcategories where necessary. As we can see on the slide, They are the duration of the filled pause in milliseconds, repetition, which breaks down into two types. The first is whether or not it's an exact repetition of the preceding filled pause. So, for example, in an instance of was the filled pause before also e. And the second one is asking if it's a repetition of the preceding pause type. So if someone was to say something like bueno, o sea, that would count as repetition because they're both the same type of pause, in this case, lexical. Then there's the phonetic context, the types of segments before and after the filled pause, as well as whether the syllables preceding and following the filled pause are stressed or unstressed. And then finally, we have interviewer filled pauses, just to be able to account for if the filled pauses used by the interviewer themselves are actually having some kind of effect on the ones the interviewee is using. Then with social factors, it's interesting. We've got some more standard ones: sex, age, region of origin, and level of education. And then there's some other ones that are used here because we're looking at a situation of language contact rather than just one where there's only one language in play. These are percentage of life lived in the US or plus. Then there's self-reported language use with selected interlocutors. Then self-reported proficiency in English and Spanish. And finally, self-reported Spanish use in selected domains. Obviously, among these last three, there's a common theme you might have noticed, which is that they're self-reported based on the interviewee's own estimations. This could, of course, pose some issues regarding the objectivity of the study, as these variables are fairly central to the analysis and results, but are, of course, self-reported and probably mostly subjective as a result. So in terms of getting an objective result, it's harder, but well, this is the approach Urker and Brusso decided to go with in the end, so onto the methods. They analysed 24 interviews with Spanish-speaking Boston residents, and there was also a questionnaire used to gather socio-demographic data, so the social factors. And in the interviews, they recorded 3,810 filled pauses in total. With the methodology, they were expanding on the comparative variationist methodology used by Lamar Graham in an earlier study. Graham used the choice between lexical and phonological filled pauses as his dependent variable. Urker and Brusso take this and use it as their basis in finding out how linguistic and social factors influence choices between lexical and phonological filled pauses. So they analysed each of the two types of filled pauses separately to see if they could pick up on any patterns of variation that related to the contact measures. Urker and Brusso, along with others, believe that the following preconceptions can lead to analytical errors. A, that contact always leads to language change, and B, that given sufficient contact and pressure, this change will be unconstrained in scope. They wanted to avoid this, so citing Poplak et al.'s version of the Lobovian variationist paradigm that compares pre- and post-contact varieties, they propose a series of steps in order to ensure that said comparison is not erroneous. So number one is to identify an appropriate contact community. Then the second one is to identify an appropriate linguistic feature to analyze to check for potential convergence as it occurs spontaneously in natural speech. The third one is to quantitatively model variation and identify the constraining social and linguistic factors acting upon the dependent variable. And then finally, the fourth one is to compare these constraints across pre, post, and non-contact varieties. They say that contact-induced change can then be inferred when a candidate for change in the contact variety features a constraint hierarchy different from that of its pre-contact predecessor, but parallel to that of its presumed source. However, due to a lack of existing data on filled pauses and the factors that constrain them in Spanish, in pre, post, and non-contact varieties, Urker and Brusso aren't able to accurately apply this. They do believe, though, that their results do indicate a change that is most likely driven by contact. Now for the results themselves. Regarding choice, the results show that generally speaking, choices between lexical or phonological filled pauses vary widely depending on the individual speaker, but they aren't actually influenced by each speaker's overall rate of use for filled pauses. The main predicting factor in determining the choice is duration of the filled pause. The shorter a filled pause is, the more likely it is to be lexical. Additionally, if there is a direct repeat of the preceding filled pause, it's also much more likely to be lexical. But of course, as we said, this study was looking at phonological and lexical filled pauses individually and seeing if there's evidence of contact-induced change or convergence. So let's look at that. If we look at lexical filled pauses, we can see some interesting things in the results. If we go to figure 14 here, It shows the difference in lexical field pause inventory size and patterns of use measured against how much the speaker uses English or Spanish in their lives. So in the middle graph here, the English only one, the first and second columns, which reflect people that use English with 50% and below of the people they talk to, shows use of all 6 lexical field pauses. On the other hand, columns 3 and 4, which is people who speak English with more than 50% of the people they speak to, show a reduced inventory among those people and an increase in the use of como, which seems like an instance of simplification. We can see a clear negative correlation here. The more a speaker uses English, the greater the decline in the lexical field pause inventory will be. So contact with English here definitely seems to be playing a role in changing these speakers' use of lexical field pauses. And now for the phonological field pauses. We can see a very clear pattern of variation here if we look at these diagrams now. They plot the vowel formant frequencies, which are F1 and F2, of the phonological field pauses against the contact measures plus percentage of life in the US and the percentage of interlocutors with whom the speaker uses English only. As we look at these, it's quite clear that generally, the more contact there is between English and Spanish in a speaker's life, the more the use of decreases and the more they'll use a and the schwa or vowels that are more central, with schwa being especially more common in English. As it doesn't really exist in Spanish, Urker and Brusso conclude that this is unlikely to be an internally driven development from Spanish. Rather, it's seen as evidence of convergence, as the speakers' inventories in English and Spanish have become closer to each other, with their use of phonological field pauses in Spanish becoming more like that of English.
By taking data from other studies and putting them into a wider context, we can strengthen the findings of the study we are looking at. The first study we're going to look at is a study conducted by Garcia, Amaya and Lang in 2020. Similarly to the Urker and Brusso study, it looks at FPs in Spanish, but this time in contact with Afrikaans. This type of language contact, as we know it, can only be found in one region of the world, in Patagonia, Argentina. The investigation looks at 3 phonetic aspects of FPs in the bilingual Spanish-Afrikaans speakers and compares them to 2 comparison groups, Spanish speakers from Patagonia and Afrikaans speakers from South Africa. These phonetic aspects were the relative use of different FP types, the spectral properties of the vocalic segments and the consonant segments contained by FPs, i.e. the first and second formant values, and the duration of vocalic and consonant segments contained by FPs. To summarise the results, the bilinguals displayed the same FP inventories as their comparison groups, although there are differences in the frequency of use and of FP types, as seen in Figure 6. In terms of vowel quality, the bilinguals displayed intermediate but separate values in their L1 and L2 languages, as shown in Figure 9. In terms of duration, the Afrikaans comparison group's FPs are consistently shorter than the Spanish comparison group's FPs. The bilingual results show different trends in vowels and consonants, as shown in the graph. The 2 conclusions posed by Garcia, Maya and Lang in the study are that FPs have multiple facets which have the potential to pattern independently, and that bilingual FPs are susceptible to the same patterns of cross-language phonetic interference as those observed in traditionally understood lexical terms. What this means is that although speaker variation plays a significant role in the choice of FPs and their production, they are still subject to influence from language contact in the same way that lexical items are. This ties in with the conclusions from the Urker and Brusso 2017 study, which also demonstrated that there appears to be language influence in terms of FPs when especially looking at the type of FP and the FP quality. Duration appears to be the most significant indicator for language convergence in this study, whereas vowel quality is seen to be a strong indicator in the 2017 study. All in all, both studies demonstrate that language contact has had an influence on FP production. The second study was a study undertaken by Justin Lowe in 2019, looking at German and French bilinguals, where speakers acquired the language at the same time. The study asks, did the speakers acquire FPs as language-specific phenomena, or do their FPs lie strictly within a speaker-specific domain? Here, the results showed a difference in the choice of FPs in German and French, with more popular in German and more popular in French. In terms of frequency, German dominant speakers produce FPs with a higher frequency than those in French by the French dominant speakers. And in terms of duration, both German dominant and French dominant speakers produce longer FPs in French than in German. When comparing the results to the Urquhart and Brousseau study, it highlights the differences between acquiring a language simultaneously in comparison to bilinguals who learn their L2 at a different time to their dominant language. The evidence shows that influence from a dominant language will interact with the weaker language, proving that language exposure is a significant factor in these languages when exploring the use of FPs. This relates directly to the findings of the 2017 study, as it showed that language exposure had the most significant effect on FP production.
Critical engagement with the findings. Urquhart and Brousseau posit two potential psycholinguistic theories that could explain the study's results. Due to the lack of contact-induced change in lexical FPs, the authors have focused on concepts which concern phonological change. The first was the cognitive load hypothesis, used by Silva-Codvalan in 1994. The hypothesis maintains that language contact causes bilinguals to develop strategies which aim to lighten the cognitive load of having to remember and use two different linguistic systems. Thus, the use of a at the expense of would be less cognitively burdensome. They also present the usage-based approach as another possible explanation, meaning a frequent use of English and increased experience with schwa might cause participants to indirectly strengthen the probability of use of am as an FP when speaking Spanish. Drawing our own conclusions on the study, we speculated that another possible justification for the use of am and at the expense of m could be suggested by the similarity attraction theory, a branch of the communication accommodation theory developed by Howard Giles in 1971. The theory suggests that non-native speakers are more likely to converge towards the native speaker's language when they identify him or her as similar to themselves, regardless of ethnic identity. In a study conducted by Young in 1998, for example, high-proficiency Chinese English language second speakers interviewed by individuals with a higher degree of social convergence were significantly more likely to converge to their interlocutor's standard English plural conjunction than those interviewed by people that differed more in terms of these social characteristics. Whilst this example was conducted in the non-native or L2 language, a bidirectional application of the theory is still relevant to our study. Participants in our study who used English with more than a third of interlocutors or have spent a larger percentage of their life in the United States are more likely to favour centralised vowels. These are also the people who spend more time with English-speaking interlocutors, making them more likely to identify similarities with themselves and therefore converge towards their language. We also considered the prospect of language attrition for the shift to centralised vowels, namely retroactive interference, which occurs when an individual is unable to recall old information because new information prevents its retrieval. First language forgetting is typically documented when speakers lose contact with their native language and are immersed in a second language speaking environment. For example, over the course of a year, Isurin in 2000 tracked language changes in a Russian-speaking orphan who was adopted at the age of 9 by an American family with no knowledge of Russian. On 5 subsequent attempts, the child either was not able to name flag in Russian or named it after an extremely long pause, whereas she successfully retrieved the item each time in English. We concluded that the centralisation of vowels could not be due to language attrition, as the process still occurred in speakers who had a good level of English, but had only spent a small proportion of their lives in the United States. Therefore, they were not immersed enough in the L2 language to forget their native language. Of course, additional research will have to be done in order to prove or disprove these theories, but Urquhart and Brousseau's study provides a strong foundation on which to expand these investigations. It would also be valuable to explore the regional variation in FPs across the Spanish-speaking world, so we have a better understanding of the effect of dialectal contact on filled pauses. Finally, we have a few questions for you guys to think about and interact with if you can. Can you think of any other instances of convergence due to language contact in any of the other languages you study? Do you think that filled pauses are a worthy unit of measurement for language convergence? What do you think the results of Urquhart and Brousseau's study indicate regarding the future of English and Spanish in the USA? And finally, does language contact always result in language change?